Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
Vertical angulation. The film and the tooth are positioned at an angle to one another. I'm directing the rays downward, casting the image upon the screen. Now, when I change the vertical angulation, I alter the length of the image of the tooth. When I'm directing the rays steeply downward, as now, the image is foreshortened. I remedy foreshortening by directing the rays not so steeply downward, but in a more upward direction. If, on the other hand, the image is too long, now we're illustrating elongation. We remedy elongation by using a steeper angulation, something like this. So it is the vertical angulation that controls the length of the image of the tooth when the tooth and the film meet at an angle. Shown radiographically are examples of normal length of the tooth, foreshortened and elongated. The remedy to the elongation instance is to increase the downward direction of the rays. The remedy to the foreshortened case is to decrease the downward direction of the rays. Now we'll demonstrate a method for choosing the proper vertical angulation. This first method requires that the tooth be positioned at an angle to the film. Now here we can see the long axis of the tooth forms an angle with the plane of the film. Now let's cut this angle in half, and we'll do so using this rod to help us visualize this bisection. And now to produce the image of correct length, we must direct the central ray, first of all, through the apex of the tooth and at right angles to the bisector. And then finally, the image of the apex would reach the film where you see it there. All right, this is known as the bisecting principle. This was first formulated by a man by the name of Price in 1904, and then later in 1907 by a doctor in Poland named Dr. Szynski. And for some reason I could never explain, this rule frequently goes by the name of Szynski's rule. If anybody's name should be applied, it should be Price's rule. So we had to direct the central ray at the apex of the tooth and at right angles to the bisector. So here is the central ray going through the apex, forming a right angle with the bisector. So I've demonstrated it on a maxillary tooth, and shown here on the diagram, we have the single-rooted mandibular tooth. So with the apex recording there and the other end of the tooth here, the image would be the same length as is the tooth. This is a beautiful drawing board illustration. However, it gets a little difficult when we're working on teeth that have more than one root. Here we have a tooth with a buccal and lingual root, and the two roots are almost the same length. Now, one of the difficulties in applying this bisecting rule is that we're never quite sure where the long axis of the tooth is, and when we're dealing with a tooth with two long axes, then our problems are compounded. Then my idea of where the bisector should lie may differ from somebody else's idea, so we can never be quite sure who is correct there. Then we must direct the invisible central ray at the apex of the tooth. Well, the apex is hidden. Here we have two apices, so which one of the two shall we aim at? Well, I'm afraid we must compromise. And then we're directing this invisible central ray at right angles to an imaginary bisector. Now, the only way you could make that more difficult would be to close both eyes. So this illustrates adequately the difficulties involved in applying this bisecting rule. The early workers in dental radiography recognized the difficulties of applying the bisecting principle, and so they soon worked out other methods for determining the vertical angulation. I believe it was purely by trial and error they discovered that most people are sufficiently alike so that if their head is held in a certain standard position, certain standard vertical angles can be applied, which will produce acceptable results in perhaps 80% of the cases. And so now we'll show you these three standardized head positions. The first applies to the maxillary teeth, and the head is positioned so the occlusal plane is horizontal and the median sagittal plane is vertical. So this will be appropriate for all of the maxillary teeth. The next head position shows the lower jaw separated from the upper jaw. Now, the reason for this is that when the film is put in the mouth, it must be held there in some manner. Perhaps the patient's finger or some mechanical device must be placed between the upper and lower set of teeth. That's why the mouth is open. Now, this head position, where the sagittal plane again is vertical and where the long axis of the central is vertical, as indicated by this colored line, this will apply to the maxillary, or rather the mandibular, centrals, laterals, and cuspids. Now, the third and last head position, again, is an open mouth position because some means are being used to hold the film in the mouth. And here the sagittal plane is vertical and the occlusal plane of the lower teeth is about horizontal. Now this head position works for the mandibular bicuspids and molars. Now, if the person does not fall into this standard bracket, for instance, if his teeth extend out labially, then we have to make certain changes. If they extend lingually, we must make certain changes. Now, here we have the standardized vertical angles. Maxillary incisor region requires 45 degrees downward. Now, if these incisors were inclined labially, then we would have to add 5 or perhaps 10 degrees to this 45, and the angle we'd use would be perhaps 50 or 55 degrees downward. If the roof of the mouth was very high, so the film would sit more nearly vertical in the mouth, then we would reduce these values for the maxillary teeth. For the lower jaw, if the floor of the mouth is high, then the film must be at a greater slant in the mouth. Then we must increase over these angles indicated for the mandibular teeth. If the floor of the mouth is very low, so the film can be positioned almost vertically, then we would diminish these indicated mandibular angles. Now we turn to our next form, our next way of determining the proper vertical angulation. A second way of positioning the film to the tooth is to have them both parallel to one another. So here we have the tooth, and I'll simply hold it parallel to the plane of the film. Now, this idea was formulated about the same time that the bisecting principle came into use. However, it was not popularized until about in the early 1920s, when a Mr. McCormick developed a technique that yielded superior results. Now, I'd like to show you one of the superiority features of this technique. Now we'll darken the room and we'll show you the shadows. With the angular method of positioning the film to the tooth, we found that the length of the image was very sensitive to the exact vertical angle employed. With the parallel positioning of the film to the tooth, the exact length of the tooth is insensitive to the angulation that we use. I direct the rays upwards, the image of the tooth moves upward. When I direct the rays downward, it moves downward, but the overall length of the image stays substantially the same. This is a very desirable feature of this method. This is one of the very few times you can see the long axis of a tooth. In fact, we've even extended it all the way up there. Now we've positioned the film so it is parallel to the long axis of the tooth. That's the first step in this method. Now we turn to the next slide. Then we must direct the rays perpendicular to the film. The apex of the tooth will record here. The incisal edge of the tooth will record there. And now we have reproduced proper tooth length. Then we go to the next slide. Here we have a type of apparatus for holding the film in the mouth. This is called a snap array. It's a plastic pliers made of radiolucent plastic, and between the jaws we grasp the film. Now when we put this in the patient's mouth, next slide please, the patient bites on this jaw of the film, of the snap array, and the film is held in the mouth reasonably parallel to the tooth. However, the mouth is closed. I can't really see in there to see whether the film is properly positioned, whether it's flat or whether it's curved. So that's one of the disadvantages to this kind of a device. Now also, I have to sterilize this device between using. So closed mouth, no film backing support, and the necessity for sterilization. Features against this device. Now we go to our next slide. Here we have used just an ordinary cotton roll to force the film into a position more or less parallel to the long axis of the tooth. Now cotton rolls are cheap, but if you're a gagger, this bothers you. And also the patient has to exert a lot of cooperation with a finger holding the packet against the cotton roll. Next we go to the slide illustrating still another type of film holder. It consists of a sheet of stainless steel. The top and lower edges are slightly curled so that they extend over the upper and lower edges of the film. On the back is a loop made of metal onto which a hemostat can grasp. The hemostat is forced through a one-hole rubber stopper. Now this device will be useful in holding the film in the patient's mouth. So here we see the device in the patient's mouth. He's biting on it to hold it in place. The mouth is wide open. We can see the film very nicely. The direction of the rays is indicated by a line through the two handles of the hemostat. Now, disadvantages to this are that the device is homemade. You can't purchase it. It's cumbersome, and you have to sterilize it, and you have to have metal plates of different sizes if you're going to use different sizes of films. Here is a film holder called the XCP instrument. It consists of a film in a holder that backs it up very nicely. The patient bites on this portion here. It would be useful in the maxillary anterior region the way I'm holding it now. While the patient is biting upon it, we would determine the proper angulation by bringing the end of the X-ray cone into coincidence with this white ring. This would determine both the vertical and the horizontal angulation. Now the device can be inverted, and then we would use it for the mandibular teeth as well. Now here is another portion of the device. It comes either left-handed or right-handed. The way it is oriented now, it would be suitable to be used in the person's upper right-hand quadrant or lower left-hand quadrant. Then we would have to reassemble it into a mirror image so that it could be used in the upper left and the lower right-hand quadrants. Now this device is expensive. You need 2 of them. You must sterilize it between uses. And the mouth is closed, which limits your visibility, and it also limits your choice of the horizontal angulation. Now another device is called a precision device. It too has a film holder into which the film is placed. It provides support for the back of the film. The patient occludes on the bite portion. Fastened to that is this large plate of metal with an aperture in it. Now to use it, we simply bring the cone of the X-ray machine against this metal plate. All right, the hole in the metal plate determines the shape and size of the X-ray beam. This limits the beam to the smallest possible size and still will expose all of the film. Now, this would work for the maxillary anteriors and the mandibular anteriors. Then we have 2 more portions of it. These are mirror images that are necessary for use in the upper and lower quadrants. Now, this device consists of 3 pieces. It's expensive, heavy, requires sterilization. The mouth is closed, and it limits the choice of the horizontal angulation. This last type of film holder is called a bite block. There is a groove into which the film is inserted. It provides a backing to the packet to keep it flat. The patient bites on the end of it to hold it in place. We notice that the plane of the film is parallel to the long axes of the centrals. Now we want to transfer a perpendicular to the film to the X-ray machine. Now the top of the block is indicating this desired right angle. This desired vertical angulation is transferred to the machine by simply aligning the top or bottom edge of the cone parallel with the top or bottom edge of the block. This automatically provides the proper vertical angulation. The bite block is cheap. Only 1 is needed to a patient. They provide good visibility, and we throw them away after use. This concludes our 3-part discussion of the production and properties of images.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.